We made ourselves a fantasy roster, one that was perfect as could be. We thought it would be easy, at least that's what some told me. Throughout the season, many things had changed, and our once perfect roster had seen plenty of players exchanged. The 2025 season has been a challenge, with the running back position being the least of our problems. Entering the fantasy championship, we are coming off a week in which more than 17 running backs posted more than 15 fantasy points the previous weeks, with many of the big names on top of the season-long rankings coming through once more. Fantasy managers must stay glued to that injury report. James Conner, Tyrone Tracy Jr., and Kenneth Walker all had MRIs on Monday, but don't fret, RotoBaller is here to help fantasy managers make those tough lineup decisions with our Week 17 starts and sits at the running back position, starting with Jonathan Taylor of the Indianapolis Colts as they take on the New York Giants. Last week, Taylor was a man possessed, one that was looking for vindication after finding himself on the blooper reel the previous week. Taylor, he took out his frustrations on the Tennessee Titans, churning out 218 rushing yards on 29 attempts, hitting pay dirt on 3 separate occasions. And if you were in that RotoBaller Discord channel, you probably heard me pounding the table for Taylor. Well, guess what? I'm going to pound the table once more this week, as Taylor is going to be staring directly across from a New York Giants defense that just allowed Bijan Robinson to run in for a pair of scores and 94 yards rushing last week. Over the last 4 weeks, New York, they have allowed 30.58 fantasy points per game to the running back position, a number that only the Cincinnati Bengals have managed to top, and that's not a good thing. In those last 4 weeks, the Giants have allowed 5 rushing touchdowns, a receiving score, 633 total yards to the position. And it's not just this 4-week sample that we're talking about. On the season, New York, they are allowing 25.35 fantasy points per game. That is the 5th most. Another running back that I'm starting this week from the New York Football Jets, it is Breece Hall taking on the Buffalo Bills. Hall, he started off the season averaging more than 20 fantasy points per contest through the first 3 weeks, but then that production, it kind of dried up. Since missing that Week 14 contest due to an injury, Hall has put together back-to-back 13-point fantasy performances and pushed his season average to 15.5 fantasy points per game. There had been discussions, I'm sure, along the way about shutting Hall down for the season, as the New York Jets' hopes ended long time ago as far as the playoffs are concerned. However, Hall said this before that Week 16 contest: "We got older guys on the team here. If they are able to come out here and play, why can't I? I don't want to be selfish and not play for a team if everybody else is playing. Guys have made that commitment." Apparently, the Jets, they felt committed to Hall as the Pro Bowl back earned 53 snaps to Braylon Allen and Isaiah Davis's 10 apiece. Expect that volume to continue this week as the Jets head into Buffalo for an AFC East divisional showdown. On the season, Buffalo has allowed 1,462 rushing yards and 10 rushing touchdowns to running backs. They have also allowed 6 additional scores in the passing game, and on 86 receptions, that has turned into 714 receiving yards and 27.17 fantasy points per game. And the final running back that I want to talk about, let's dig a little deeper, shall we? It is Gus Edwards of the Los Angeles Chargers that take on the Indianapolis Colts. Now, first and foremost, start your studs. And if you're one of those managers out there looking for a replacement for a James Conner, or Tracy, or even a Kenneth Walker, then the Gus bus, it could be ready to go here, fueled up and ready to churn out some more yards this week for your lineup. The New England Patriots are ranked 9th in fantasy points on the season and 9th over the last 4 weeks as well. During the season, they have allowed 24.37 fantasy points per game to the running back position, allowing 1,733 rushing yards and 13 touchdowns. They have also yielded 5 receiving touchdowns to backs. Over the last 4 weeks, they've allowed 24.8 fantasy points and surrendered 308 rushing yards and 5 total touchdowns. We know Edwards and the Chargers' run game can be difficult to trust, especially with fantasy glory on the line. But no risk it, no biscuit. There's no reward to take if you don't take that risk. And that's what my mama always said. Edwards, he's coming off a 2-touchdown performance in week number 16, which led to 20.1 fantasy points. The Chargers, they should get out early on this contest and basically bleed that clock with Edwards, as Harbaugh likes to do. It is worth noting that the Chargers did designate J.K. Dobbins to return from the IR on Monday. Now, that is worth noting because if Dobbins does play, you're going to start him in your fantasy football lineups, and Gus Bus, it stays parked this week. Now, there's other running backs that are going to stay parked on your bench. How about Chuba Hubbard of the Carolina Panthers as they take on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers? Now, again, the volume is going to be there. It's going to get fantasy managers excited. And you know what? Rightfully so. Chuba Hubbard, he has been that guy. But you know who else has been that guy? Vita Vea and the top-ranked fantasy defense against opposing backs over the last 5 weeks. Tampa Bay, they enter Week 16 allowing just 12.05 fantasy points per game to the position over the last 4 weeks. And over that period, they've allowed just 216 rushing yards and 86 receiving yards to the position. In Week 16, the Buccaneers' stout defense, it did its job against the Dallas Cowboys, most notably Rico Dowdle, who averaged 1.8 yards per carry on his 13 attempts. My heart, it wants to start Chuba Hubbard. Last week, he became the first Panther since Christian McCaffrey to run for 150 yards and a pair of touchdowns, calling ball game in overtime against the Cardinals. Hubbard is the same man that many thought would have his job taken away from him by Jonathan Brooks. Not only has he kept that job, but he's now found himself as the RB12 in fantasy heading into week number 17. Not to mention, he sits 5th in the league in rushing yards with 1,195. But for me, it's all about this matchup, and I want to avoid risk when it matters the most. And speaking of running backs that probably don't matter this week, how about Rico Dowdle of the Dallas Cowboys as they take on the Philadelphia Eagles? Not only was last week's performance a fantasy dud, but this week it doesn't project to get any better. This season, the Eagles have allowed just 1,164 rushing yards to the running back position, along with just 5 scores. In terms of fantasy, that equates to 16.91 fantasy points per game. Only the Chiefs are allowing fewer. With the Eagles most likely without Jalen Hurts this week due to a concussion, Philadelphia is expected to run the ball, which is going to speed up the clock and limit those Cowboy possessions. As good as Dowdle has been at times, Brian Robinson Jr., a guy I absolutely love, was held in check, averaging just 2.4 yards per carry on his 10 rushing attempts last week against this Eagles defense. And speaking of Brian Robinson Jr., you're sitting him too this week as the Commanders, they take on the Atlanta Falcons. Basically call this a running back pyramid scheme that I am running here each and every week, well, at least this week for that matter, when we talk about my sit list. If I've mentioned this back, there's a good chance that I'm going to mention him again here. Brian Robinson Jr., he struggled against the Eagles. We talked about that, rushing for just 24 yards on 10 attempts. While Atlanta, on paper, is a more favorable matchup, they're currently sitting 9th in terms of fantasy points allowed to the position this season, allowing just 20.65 fantasy points per game and just 16.97 over the last 4 weeks. Look for Jaden Daniels to continue his Rookie of the Year push through the air as the Falcons have been more susceptible this season through the passing game there, allowing 37.65 fantasy points per game. That is the 3rd most to the wide receiver position. And if you want to position yourself to win not only this year, but next year, head over to RotoBaller.com to get all the latest news and fantasy analysis. And head over to the RotoBaller Discord channel where you'll find me there 24/7 answering all your fantasy football needs. We'll talk to you later.